Hello everyone, today we talk about Woths, Ódhr, Furor, Dásacht, Thyás, Ferg, and all names that, I don't know, some of you are more or less acquainted with, and this makes it a bit of a different video from the usual. So today I would like to concentrate. It's essentially a video about etymologies of Indo-European etymologies, and something I got, quite amateurly in just recently by approaching certain topics mostly related to the Indo-European history of the origins, let's say a little bit, but mostly looking at the concept of the psychology of war into certain eras I usually comment on Schwerpunkt. I usually discuss from a military historical point of view, and I approach this as some of you who follow me regularly know that I have a pretty, and at least I emphasize at least a lot on Schwerpunkt, the direct connection that existed between this Indo-European background of two other entities in history that also can be very early in time, such as the Roman Empire, but I mostly will discuss this about chivalry proper, that sometimes we think as if they were essentially separated chunks on their own. Like as if the Roman Empire was a sort of modern secular state that, I don't know, came out of the blue, or the chivalry just like this romantic mythology of a strictly Western based thing in the sense of the narrowest sense of Western Europe, and I'm trying on Schwerpunkt step by step tiny bit by tiny bit to, let's say, not to debunk this, because obviously it's full of of books that have been written about this topic, and it's also rather famous to anyone who's acquainted to, I don't know, Indo-European studies or simple history, because I'm approaching this as a very humble medievalist, and although I realize it's something that is often overlooked, because at least I was lucky enough to get acquainted a little bit with history of religions and anthropology a little bit as well. Not much, because I don't know almost anything about it. I just made some exams, but I kind of got used to these perspectives, and I realized that if I hadn't, I would still have a pretty, and I definitely still have, but it would be worse than now, a pretty modernistic mindset, naturally, an approach towards certain topics that shouldn't really be. So why etymologies now, and why these words? Actually, the Woths, it's something you may, especially given the background picture I chose today, you can immediately realize what's referred to. So to Woden, or Wotan, as you want to call it, that is Odin, essentially the ancient Odin. Has actually the same figure, but also in here there was an evolution in the history of, and obviously in the Germanic mythology and so on. But going strict to the words, the point I would like to make is telling the truth related to strictly military topics. That is essentially looking at the ancient world, and not only just that one, but realizing how there was a continuity and a similarity, and definitely not just a similarity, but a lot in common between the concept of military, how we want to call it. It's even difficult to even call it military at this point, but this warlike feeling of trance, of fury, in fact, as one point it was called. But as we will see here, that there are extremely important semantic shades we have to take into considerations. That is essentially the warlike ethos of the, can say, Indo-European warrior, And from that, lots of other, basically the military culture of all the populations that descended from it. So we're talking, when we think about the Furor, the Woths, etc., even the people who know what we're talking about, so it's mostly a Germanic and even Celtic thing. There's this tendency to basically circumscribe this idea of the Furor Teutonicos, in fact, just to this kind of northern world that sounds as if, as if it had been the only one to have this prerogative of these furious warriors that were such for known precise reasons. But actually, this feeling was something that existed all over the Indo-European peoples. And just yesterday, by reading a bit of the Latin concept of Vertus, that is the virtue essentially, and Audacia, or Audacia if you prefer the ecclesiastical language, so the boldness, essentially the to find a better definition, I would say the boldness is fine, essentially. And confronting it with especially seeing how these terms were used when, especially the term virtus, when describing the say military attitudes of the Celtic Germanic populations that the Romans came into contact with. I realized, and maybe I will leave this for another video, that actually the Romans were actually complementing these populations, as if there are certain interpretations that because now it's very complicated. I don't know why I started this. I should stick to the etymology, but it's still very important to express, because the virtus is properly the major. It can have many translations. It can, but probably given the etymology that is the same of vir, that is of man, it expresses manliness, manhood, virility. But in the strictly military sense, it can equate also, and it entails definitely courage, resolutiveness. Then eventually this term is really transformed in our societies a lot, because eventually it was taken by the Christians, that naturally made this great work of integration of classical concepts and virtues into a Christian fashion, so that the virtue at that point with Christianization kind of resembles what mostly we intend today. That is the virtue proper, or the goodness, if you want. A virtuous person is a person who has so many good qualities, with such a good person. Sometimes virtue can be interpreted also as character, as excellence. So other semantic shades that, however, cannot render really the properly in at least in English there is not a proper translation of virtus, and arguably there is not for any language, because any language has its own specific meaning that you can maybe transliterate at best, but still not fully owning. There is obviously huge studies on the philosophy of language that tell you that we can't basically even understand what we ourselves are saying. So even the concept of translating is mostly pragmatically based. And I love translations, etymologies, and so on, even if I'm not a linguist at all, and I have a very poor knowledge in general. But especially given my occupation, and I realize it when I read sources sometimes in certain foreign languages and so on. But say that when talking about virtus, probably the best term you can use is manliness, manhood, virility, because this is, at least from it's the way the Romans, the Latins used it. It would mean essentially this. And naturally also in that world it entailed a much broader range of meanings, because obviously even during Roman times the virtus actually changed in, it probably also expanded philosophically speaking. I mean, in the late Republic, it was evidently assuming also other many more strictly civical, but also more philosophical. It was being applied to, for instance, certain philosophical systems. Now the Roman elites were taken from the Hellenic philosophies and so on. So this is not common. Today I want to go at the origin of this, because we have so much transformed ourselves the term of virtue that it's extremely difficult sometimes to understand the originary meaning. And the originary meaning would be, in my opinion, and that's why the Romans were using it to define the behavior of the Celtic or Germanic chieftains or warriors in general, because it's actually a very positive name. The virtue as such was in fact represented the sum of those mainly qualities that essentially brought at the greatness of Rome. So you might say, well, why the Romans were essentially giving the same term, the same sort of maybe more of a charisma, if we wanted to use the Greek term instead. That even though it's a very difficult thing to say, but charisma is also good because it stresses the magical and sacral acception of the term, a sort of mana that functioned into the field of martial arts. And for the Romans, Virtus was actually an extremely important figure. It was a deity, as a matter of fact. The Romans venerated it as such. It basically, the virtue is what renders, according to Cicero, the man similar to the gods. So now, if you have Alton here, I have to necessarily address you or readdress you, given I've done it a freaking lot of times at this point, to the video at, well, maybe the time you're simply give you the title, because now it's on the wallpaper of Schwerpunkt, but it might be changed at the time you're listening to this, so I don't really know. And the title is The Roman Eagle, an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march, which is another, it's probably my most powerful video in the sense it's the one in which I stress and I came up essentially with this concept that is also very well known in Indo-Europeans, that of how much the Romans were actually tied to their Indo-European roots, and how the eagle symbolizes essentially the military glory of the Aryan celestial deity of the Overlord that brought victory and glory to the with the wings to the Indo-European warrior. The same is in the Hellenic Nike, for instance. Even in the Germanic mythology, you find all these kind of flying, even the Valkyries that we will talk about today, or other. Even in the Celtic world, we find these winged helmets, because they all stuck to that common Indo-European cauldron that essentially conceived the military glory as essentially as a gift to the virtues, in fact, from the divine entity of the sky. And this is what really the point is, that the whole, even if you look at the whole Roman military ethics, you know, the idea that, for instance, the glorious commander that was indeed during the triumph assimilated to the gods, but it was essentially just bringing his crown eventually to the temple of Jupiter to essentially give back the glory, the glory of the skies to whom had given to them. So the idea that victory is never a human accomplishment but a divine one. So that this was the full concept, the very deep concept that permeated the whole Indo-European society, which was a warrior society in the origin. So the concept that you cannot win a war, for instance, a battle, if you do not get the power from the skies. And this is something that I suspect remained a freaking lot even during the migration era, and even longer into the High Middle Ages, into the same Christian thinking. Because objectively there were many, it's not really just about the Indo-Europeans. Telling the truth, many other populations had similar thoughts. This is something you can see even in, I don't know, in Egypt but it's really important that the military glory is divine. So it doesn't belong to mankind, it belongs to the gods, and it is conferred just to the virtuous individual. And that's the only way the mankind can participate in this sense to the divine glory. And that's also in that video on the Roman eagle. I explained the rite of the cursio. During the funeral of Roman emperors, the practice was essentially this one, that basically this was the imperator. Okay, so not just the Roman emperor as a weird, I don't know, guy, absolute monarch that stays there for no particular reason, for kind of classist interpretations and so on, but the emperor as the one who objectively possessed, owned the imperium, that is essentially this force, this might, that was conferred by the gods. And the deification of the emperor that came essentially during the funeral, as the pyre that was set on fire, was meant to bring the soul of the emperor together with one of the gods in the skies. And while the pyre was burning, all the Roman say war heroes essentially took off their decorations and threw them into the pyre, because that what meant to give back the military glory to the gods who had given it to you, because that's where it belonged. It really belonged to the skies, to the heavens, not to man. And this was done on horseback as well, when knights, the Roman knights, actually running around. And this also stresses the importance of the horse, that I will hopefully get much into another video, because it's really extraordinary. And since we talk about chivalry, we can't avoid to do that, because there is a whole universe behind the concept of chivalry that in fact stems from when the Indo-Europeans were still populations, horse riding peoples of the steppes, and that definitely had and this is the point. There is this myth that chivalry was born in the Middle Ages. No, it wasn't. It was always there, at least for the Europeans, the Indo-Europeans as such. Even when they settled down into Western Europe, into sanitary societies, they still retained a huge memory, a huge feeling in all their religions. This is easily evident about this, the sacred value and the military nature of the horse. Even the Romans were also here unjustifiably credited very often with the fact that they didn't care about cavalry. This is actually false. I mean, there were structural reasons for which there was a few Roman cavalry that maybe one day we will also discuss, but the Romans, the few cavalry they had, they put a huge importance to. And this is a very few thing. And actually the Romans had very strong cavalry. This is something that people overlook all the time, because they're not capable of, simply because they don't study military history, they don't see how that Roman cavalry, basically in conditions of equal numbers, was never defeated. And the Romans had even better generals than horse commanders, than cavalry commanders, than the Carthaginians, who used Numidian cavalry, for instance. But this is another chapter, and I know I like to, it's not that I like to make myth busting, but it's really that I love these parts of history so much that I still can't believe that such prejudices are so widespread. Excuse me, I drink a little bit more. So talking about the Virtus, I know at this point my videos are a big circle. If you want to understand them, you have to listen to the end, because I start even a bit confusedly, but I always get to the point. At least I always try to at least to cover all the parts I wanted to, and I promise you that this is gonna do, because this is actually still a premise. As the Virtus, this is important what to stress, was the so there is a similar term to Virtus in Greek actually, which is the arete, which is a also translatable as virtue, but has slightly different meaning. The Virtus instead among the Romans, because the Greek arete, it's very connected to also the political culture of the Hellenic world, that at this time was still, of course, it definitely retained also Indo-European, heavy Indo-European identities and so on, but the Romans came from a much more warlike background than the Greeks at this time, and the Virtus represented for the Romans the activity, if you want, of the great man, also in here of state, but also of the bold soldier. And these things actually shouldn't be disconnected in origin, because the virtue naturally also in Rome, and exactly by Greek influence, if you want, or in part, but simply because Roman society grew naturally very different from the one of the origins. By the way, the Romans had this extremely speedy transformation that you don't find in other peoples so easily, from the tribal background to the, to the state, so that the Virtus came to identify also the qualities of any man of state, eventually also in the empire and so on. But actually, this man of state in origin was the same bold soldier in some way, and this was called, as Livy says, the comes virtutis. So we also have to talk about the comitatus as well, but this man is basically opened the path of the sky, as Cicero says, because his merit basically disclosed to him the gates of eternity. And this is evidently Indo-European. It stresses the fact that the man of state in origin, in archaic Rome, was nothing but a military commander. This is the point. That's how the Romans created the empire in the first place, and that's how their military, their warlike ethos that we decided to erase, because we have as dumb fucks to divide Rome from the Celts of Germans, as if Rome was a 19th century nation state in Nute, and the Celts and the Germans were a bunch just of drunknards that came shouting and clashing like animals. And we're so dumb at thinking such things, but actually this was all one thing. Here, the gate of eternity is something you can achieve in the Indo-European perspective only through war, through military activity. Also, Horace says that if you in one of his Carmina, this thing of the gate of eternity, and it was the bold soldier. So not, by the way, a soldier like the others, but actually a bold soldier that is essentially a warrior. There's an excruciating difference between soldiers and warriors, which also, as modern idiots, we're kind of mixing once again up, because we are ignorant and we don't know the meaning of the words, and it's a shame that we need to think of our military as warriors, because actually they are not, and the way why we kick ass, it's exactly because our military are soldiers and not warriors. And I still can't, I don't like this kind of tribal, at least for our own societies, it's completely ridiculous to stress such conception of our military. But just to give you to show you a bit more how the Virtus was associated to the military quality, we know that by 205 BC, a temple to the Vertus had been consecrated in front of Porta Capena, so it was one of the gates of Rome, in the immediate nearby of the temple of Honors, that is the honor. And the sacred essentially the sacraria de facto of these two temples were also very close to the one of Mars. And they the rites that occurred in front of these gods were cavalry rites, the cavalry parades. So you see this thing of the cavalry, of the concept of virtue, of the celestial, of the mankind that lifts itself to the celestial grounds. This is all pure Aryan stuff. And I don't mean it in any ideological forms, I mean it Aryan as Indo-European. And that's what the Romans were. And when Augustus was honored by the Senate at his rise, he was given a golden shield, the Clipos, which was called Clipos Virtutis, that is the shield of virtue. And this was also engraved into the same. This writing was engraved in the same shield, and there are, I think, also some money, some coins that display this. So there was a triumphal march of virtue attached to these rites as well. And the first depiction we have of virtue, there was actually a female. She is it's roughly around the time of Nero. She appears in a armor and equipped with a lance and a gladius, and she steps with her feet, with her foot, her right foot over the elm of the fallen enemy. So then there are other representations, because also this iconography changes over time, but it's always, however, virtue is always leaning on her shield and on a conquered cuirass over which she's enthroned, and she's surrounded by symbols of the military campaigns and of victories in this branch of olive, as a symbol of answering peace. And in fact, virtue is both associated to the Fortuna and the Victoria. So the idea is virtue, the Virtus is also bringing, it's not just about war, it's not obviously she's immediately about war, but she's also meant to bring, in this sense, a reward, a munus, so in Latin. So the idea that you're going to achieve, in fact, glory, victory, fortune, welfare through such a virtue, because that was objectively what he was. The glorious commander was not just a commander, but he's also a chieftain. Naturally, the Romans at this time went well past the eminently tribal mindset in terms of political and social organization, but they still attributed to the emperor this role of military commander that is naturally was a ruler also at the time, was de facto now a monarch, but was still conceived in this sense as leader of troops, and as he who basically leading the Roman people would ensure peace and prosperity through victory, which was achievable only through the Virtus. A non-virtuous commander could not obtain the military glory of the sky. And in this sense, the glory was quite picky in the sense that there are many myths also in the Persian tradition and so on that show how even saying something, telling a lie, for instance, could really make the deity, the celestial deity, take away the glory from you, and you would simply ruin. So it was no accomplishment of yours. I mean, you had to have this inner predisposition, and we'll see how this is important also to understand the concept of Vodanic fury, because it's not something you can achieve, just like that. Also, the myth of the basically of the frenzy berserkers, if these guys were so emotionally reactive for some reason. No, there was a very strong spiritual preparation for achieving this. It was a community. Actually, it has much to do with the same concept of the comitatus that is opposed to the sippe, so the strongly military community. That is something you find also in here in the Latin word with the comes virtutis, indeed. So he's not just a guy wherever, he's a comes. So he's actually a guy who belongs to this brotherhood of men. So this brotherhood of also manlyhood that has to do with the arms and deity. And in origin, the Romulus was exactly this. He had his own celeres, that were essentially these knights, these cavalrymen. He went around Rome sacking, actually at that time it was within the same boundaries of what the city would have expanded like, but going to fight against the Sabines, and other, because that was the war. It was the comitatus. It was the same thing you find in Tacitus' Germania, with the Germans joining these military leaders, and in fact are called to have had the Virtus from the Latin sources. So not something that was inherently different from the same Roman Virtus, because it was recognized more obviously. Maybe it's difficult to say whether it was rationalized or not, but definitely it was recognized. Definitely, because it's the same linguistical, it's the same word that is being used in here, as the same military virtue the Romans had been about, just like the Celts, just like the Germans. The Italics were extremely close to the Celts in culture, in traditions, in things. I repeat, it's shameful how we have to draw a line between the Romans and these other Central European populations. By the way, the Romans are a different thing in the sense that the concept of Roman entails a political, it entails a citizenship, so it's not really about the Romans, but it's really this Latin, Italic, let's say, cultural background that was not, was definitely something very close in its traditions to also to these other warlike peoples of Central Europe, and they all, because they came all from the same stock essentially. What is interesting is that this the role of Virtus into Roman history basically never changes. Even her association to the Fortuna and the Victoria remain kind of the same. And another extraordinary aspect of this is that the representation of the Virtus is extremely close iconographically to the one of Rome herself as a deity. And when we lack inscriptions, it's actually extremely difficult to distinguish Virtus from Roma. And in fact, sometimes in the specialist field they're called like Roma Virtus at the same time, because they both, by the way, bring the epithet of Aeterna, or Eterna if you prefer the ecclesiastical translation. So Roma and Vertus were eternal, and they were essentially, it's as if they had been the same thing. Obviously not exactly the same thing, but they had this consubstantial nature of being eternal, because the military glory of the sky is eternal. So that's what the empire is, what the Roman Empire was. And that's why when the Germans actually inherited the Roman legacy, actually they were extremely eager to seize that as, in fact, this military glory. So that still in the full Middle Ages, when the Germanic populations, at least the ones in the West, had been fully Christianized, you still see that this concept was well alive, because the same translatio imperii of the Roman Empire to the Germanic one was based on this concept. And we don't see it much, because at that time most of the sources were written by the clergy, so they were stressing now a more, kind of more comforting Christian ideal that was also much more abstract by certain standards. But you have to think in the mindset of, I don't know, like of Charlemagne, let's say. The concept of having seized the empire from the Roman times, that actually had finished just 300 years before, and it wasn't actually a very long time, came from this military ideal that existed in the Germanic world, in the Frankish mindset, as much as it existed to the Roman one, especially of the origins. So this is extraordinary, in my opinion. So we could add something more about the Vertus, maybe, but this was associated in part also to the slightly to the so-called Jus Armorum, that now we will see was essentially the well, we don't have time to look at all these in detail, but let's say that the virtue, especially in imperial times, started to be increasingly more associated to the figure of the emperor, naturally, for ideological, propagandistic reasons that are self-evident. But it starts also to enter into this space of not just individual prowess, or the individual virtue, in fact, but also associated, always to the emperor as an individual virtue, but it also to the collectivity of the soldiers as such. So you find expressions like virtus militum, virtus equitum, virtus exercitus, so the virtue of the soldiers, the virtues of the knights, the virtues of the army as a whole, and that are naturally attributed chiefly to the commander, because this was also the point. It was the same concept of the empire that inherently had the idea of the leader in it. The Indo-European society is all about the leader in this sense, about the guide. So this was attributed to the emperor, but it was something that still had to do potentially with the individual qualities of the warrior as such, because theoretically speaking, every freeman could achieve, if it was virtuous enough, in fact, such glory through the favor of the gods. And very close, by the way, the virtue was extremely close also to Jupiter in many ways. So the father of the gods, the celestial deity pro excellence, the celestial deity of the Indo-Europeans by excellence, and the this was associated in part, well, maybe we'll skip this, there would be a lot to say now, but other symbolisms we find, but however, everything was really, this is the essential. Virtus equates to the military virtue of the Indo-European warrior. This is the point. The only one that can make the guy access. So why were the Romans, the gates of heaven? So why were the Romans using this term for alleged barbarians, because obviously they were recognizing very differently from other cultural perspectives that well, don't make me go too much in detail into this, but the concept is that the Celts and the Germans still owned this. Tacitus speaks of the Vertus as for the Germans. So this maybe in Tacitus was a bit more shifting towards that ideal of charisma that was conceived before as a magical sacred force, but it was at the same time really the same concept of the virtue, because the virtue in this sense created a magic and sacral net between the individual and the deity. It's through the virtues, through the virtue that the warrior can enter in contact with the deity and receiving the glory. And this was not, in fact, so. It was a very mystical relation. It wasn't something that could be really, practically achieved by simply a certain rite. Or obviously, there had to be a great respect for the gods. The Virtus, in fact, in Latin, also entailed a religious virtue in overall. Actually, it's very complicated because not so complicated, because in Latin there was the pietas as well that stressed instead the respect for the gods, this religious behavior, etc. But it's as if the virtus encompassed and comprehended all the other Roman virtues. The virtus actually stemmed from all the other virtues coming together. So this is also very important, because you realize that it's as if the whole society, under every point of view, converged into this strictly military conception. And this was also typical of Indo-European societies that were all militarized, and they revolved around war. There was nothing like working, theoretically. Only slaves worked, and slaves were usually conquered people, essentially. So it's as if the whole society had revolved around the leaders, the military leaders, and so it was, ideally, conceptually. Then, obviously, when we talk about the Romans, we have to understand that these were concepts that were naturally brought from a distant past in a society that was naturally evolving in a very different way, and so on. But they were so strong that it actually permeated still the whole political theory, the whole religion, the whole concept, and eventually this was partially lost. It would be very interesting to find something to talk to you about relatively to how this changed into Christian times, and especially looking at the Eastern Roman Empire, because I actually have read that naturally always the Byzantine emperors also maintained these characters in theory, but now they were also mitigated partly. But the idea of being especially an able warrior that was still out there, and still, if you look in the darkest hour of the empire in the 7th century, you see that this what was a formerly Christian army actually still retained an extremely strong pagan military ethics. The values of the ideas of glory, so were essentially still the same of the ancient world. So this is important because you see that also into the Middle Ages, into this passage, from antiquity to the modern age, essentially, there is a very strong persistence and continuity of such ideals eventually. So the point I was trying to make is that the Romans were stressing these qualities also for these other warlike populations that were meeting. There was also another term that that the Latins used to define is probably more meaningful to explain. That is Audacia. We said it before, or Audacia if you prefer. In Ecclesiastes, I always say I like to speak in the pronunciatio restituta. That is actually how we believe, although we didn't have recorders at the time to let us know how it really was, how the ancient Latin actually sounded. But you know, if you say Audacia or if you say Audacia, eventually in the second letter, it's in the ecclesiastical pronunciation, it's the same. So if you hear me saying the two names, for the sake of spare me repetitions, I usually say first especially in these archaic contexts, classical context, first the pronunciatio restituta and then the ecclesiastical pronunciation. Okay, so Audacia and Audacia. So Audacia meant literally audacity, in fact, daring, boldness, provocativeness, and this is a term that also the Romans used a lot to define the barbarian populations they met. Actually, Audacia in here is not, however, all negative. We shouldn't stress really too much, because the Romans eventually, especially during the late Empire with Vertus and so on, they started to stress that the Romans were a bit, naturally, the Romans were superior to barbarians because they had discipline, order, and what more generally the Romans called the jus armorum. So the jus armorum, we didn't explain it before. It basically derived from this rational geometrical line that the Roman military art evolved in. So, making this very concrete and juridical mentality of the Romans, conceiving the term of jus armorum, that is essentially the law of the arms. So it was something a bit more artificial, because it basically entailed, now in here it would be interesting to analyze etymologically, especially the concept of jus armorum, because it's not fully devoid also in here of it's not pure rational terms, but the Romans were trying to stress that they were better at war, essentially because they had this military art that the Celts and the Germans didn't have. So in here it was a bit more of a it's complicated to explain now, but the fact that the Romans were stressing this doesn't mean that they still condemned the concept of audacity also in the Celtic and in Germanic world, because actually the Romans themselves retained a freaking lot of that audacity themselves. There is a beautiful quote from Virgil's Aeneid that is "Audentes fortuna juvat," so that would be literally the fortune favors the bold. And this is very meaningful. It was written by Virgil in the Aeneid, because this is actually Aeneas. I don't know how you pronounce it in English. If it had been in Latin at the time, it would have been Aeneas, essentially, I think. This is what essentially the Trojan hero tells when. What Turnus, actually, that was the enemy of Aeneas, tells to his men before attacking Aeneas, and naturally this eventually Turnus eventually loses. So it's not really a great slogan at the end, because Aeneas eventually wins with a more comprehensive virtue. So the Audacia is not really absolutely equatable to the Vertus. It's something really less meaningful, but it still had a positive and negative acception. That is, because it can, in the good sense, it can be intrepidity, courage, valor, confidence. In the bad sense, it can be basically all. It's as if there were the pro and cons of the thing. So it is audacity in the sense of impetuosity, recklessness, rashness, presumption, insolence as well. But this was shaded indeed, so that also in here we should touch the concept of how there was indeed a more of a irrational warfare that was conceived, always losing towards the rational one. And also in here the idea of rationality is much less secular than we imagine, but if you take the Hellenic mythology, for instance, you find that Athena constantly wins over Ares in war. Because they're both deities of war, but Athena is also the goddess of wisdom principally, and this wisdom also, that's a very important Indo-European root. For instance, in this case in the Hellenic mythology, it's not a wisdom like in any other one. Naturally, the Greeks made of Athena a bit the symbol of political wisdom as well, in the sense that they were praising now their political model of the polis, in fact, as a bit the symbol of reason that wins over the barbarians that are led instead by Ares. So that Ares was a much more beast-like concept of war that in this sense pertained and belonged initially, well, not really as much, but it's what basically the difference is between this wisdom, this knowledge that you find also in Odin, in Woden, etc., opposed to deities like Thor. That would be a bit like the Ares because it's very easy to have hot, impetuous warriors, but only the wise one actually leads them and leads them to victory. So obviously being audacious is necessary to fight, because it also, to be audacious entails you have at least courage, but courage is never enough. Military history proves dramatically that you can be courageous how much you like, but if you don't have an effective political and military guide, you're gonna lose badly. So human courage is boundless, but it's not necessary to achieve victory. This is another very stupid prejudice that we have when looking at the past, that reveals people's historical ignorance, especially in military history, thinking that a people wins because it's more courageous than another. Most of the times, this rule actually doesn't even find any evidence. And the ancient world is a perfectly beautiful way to look at this, because even if you realize how the Romans rose to power, essentially they began to conquer the world when they transformed from these Italic tribal warriors into essentially professional, disciplined war professionals, that is, soldiers eventually. So I don't know where I was going with this, but sometimes the Latins instead in here were criticizing a bit of the Audacia, but not the Vertus, because this is a mistake that I found in some book, that it's as if the Romans were despising even the Celts of Germans by saying they had their military leaders, some of them had a Vertus, mixing this with Audacia, as if they were not equivalents, but part of this kind of still beast-like war. Instead, no, there is a huge difference, and in the Romans were recognizing the same Vertus they were worshipping also for these barbarian hosts. So also in here, sometimes you find that the Woth, from which, in fact, it means from the that it's relatable to the Gothic Woths, that it basically means possessed. The fanatics had this Woth, essentially this was translated effectively afterwards with fury as well, that went a bit into another direction, but that we will say it maybe a bit later. Is relatable. Woths is relatable to the Vertus in practice. So the Woths comes from the, as we've seen, to this etymological root that is very very widespread also in the old Indo-European languages, that eventually gave the name to the deity of Woden, of Wotan. So if you look, for instance, at the Sanskrit, if you make a comparison between this root Vut or Vat, etc., you find pretty interesting things. Basically, the Vut, as far as I've understood, comes from the Indo-European root Vad, which it gave the name to so many things. It gave the name to Vater in German, that it would be the equivalent of father, of pater in Latin. This is something you find also in other languages. And what does this root actually mean? Well, in Sanskrit, for instance, vadati means to speak, to say, to tell, to predict as well. Hence you have the Latin vates, that is essentially the I don't know how to say this, but it's like the he who, not like a bit the prophet, the fortune teller, the soothsayer. So these figures that actually are pretty much, and in the Latin vates were naturally eventually risen to the even here we're talking about different societies, but essentially soothsayers were present basically everywhere in the Indo-European world, because they were people, and also in any other tribal society, any other world, because these were the people who were conceived, in fact, to have this ability of speaking, of letting the divinity speak through them. So this root of Woths, from which Woden actually comes from, it's basically what Odin is, what Woden is. It's someone who is able to confer to you this kind of divine wisdom, this saying that permeates you and possesses you. Always in Sanskrit, just to give you a dimension of how this Vad root is so important linguistically speaking. Vada means orator, he who announces. Vadman is he who speaks. It would be the speaking man. In fact, man here goes for the same concept of man. It's he who does that. Vada is the one who speaks of. It can also equate to discussion or doctrine. The same Vedic world comes from this root, because it was based on this ability of speaking from the gods. Vadana is the musician as well. So not a language like something you can't really put into written record, but something that is expressed at so many levels. And this is what our modern mindset has forgotten about those worlds, that the messages, the wisdom, the knowledge were not something you could simply put on script. Sometimes it happened, even if you look at the runes or this symbolism, but it was part of a much broader language that entailed the relation between man and nature, this kind of sensitivity, of sensibility. we'll have to talk massively about this when talking about the comitatus in the Germanic world, and how these individuals were literally called by the deity to cease to exist, because at that time they were possessed by the divinity, and they were the same divinity in part. So this is the concept of where Woths comes from. Now going on, Vadin, also, always in Sanskrit, Vadin is speaker, the master of dialectics. Vad, here there is the V that would be the same root of versus, essentially. So it's a positive. Vad means to contradict, to oppose. Vada is the argument, the quarrel, the fight, even if you want. And just to tell you how this idea of wisdom was, I don't know whether Vertus actually also has this root, but if Vir has to do with Vadsam, I don't think so, but sometimes these words were already all connected in origin, and they were extremely important. It's extremely important to look at these similarities, because they give you this beautiful semantic shade of what this world was really conceived, because it was all one. All these concepts were permeating the whole life, the whole social life, daily life. These people reasoned through these concepts. Their minds were much simpler than we can imagine. Even the language you see here, it's more simple. The beauty of languages like Sanskrit, like Latin, like Old German, even ancient Greek and so on, it's that they are so contracted. But in this sense, every one of them has this extremely powerful semantic richness, so that they can be. It's a simpler language that reflects a simpler word, but at the same time, a word was lived much more intensely with so many different, different undertones. I don't know what to say, and that were declined to a vision of the world, a conception of the world, a living of the world, that in this sense was able to look at the whole thing as into this perspective. Another very important term is Ódhr. So Ódhr can be translated very loosely as Furor. Let's see if we can. That give you really also here the dimension of the wisdom and of the knowledge, because for instance in Old Icelandic, there is a sort of complementary meaning between the term Ódhr, that is the Furor, and Ódhr, that is poetry. So this is very important, because eventually this is the same root that gives the name to Odin. And we don't really know, because Odin in this sense was the same Ódhr and Ódhr. And the suffix in, so Ódhr, is something that we don't know whether it was used probably to make this name pass from an abstract concept to a proper name of a deity in this case. So Odin was both the inspirer of such furor and of poetry, and the same feeling that he inspired at the same time. So why were all the sagas, the runes, so magically believed in this sense? Because they were conceived as the deity itself. And it was believed that through this wisdom, through this knowledge, loosely definable like this, that was knowledge as furor, as fury, and as poetry at the same time. So you realize that the fury, also in here, a very big mistake that is done is people think it's just fury, as if these guys went nuts. They freaked out, they got frenzy, and that's it. No, it was something much deeper. It's something that had to do, in fact, with the brotherhood of these warriors that joined together to experience this life, because at that point their lives didn't belong to them anymore, but to the deity itself, by getting to know that wisdom. The Celts did similar things too. The Celts had certain gatherings for which, belonging to these military bands, these warrior bands, they essentially behaved as if their lives were not important anymore in front of this comitatus. And the one who arrived, the latest person who arrived at the gathering, the latest warrior, and there was always one, naturally, who had to be the last, obviously, was slaughtered. Just to make them understand that their life didn't belong to them anymore, and that there was this general will that could, in general, even random series of circumstances that would make the last arrive last. So an incomprehensible knowledge. I mean, a knowledge that could be paradoxically misunderstood, rationally speaking, but that had to be accepted as such. And that's why the Wodanic rites entail this fanatism, this idea of getting completely forgetful about yourself, because you have to fully accept, or better, it was the god who took you and made you grow forgetful about yourself. And that's why Wodan is actually also the deity of war, and why as we get from the Roman ethnography, the Germans had this kind of veneration for him, because the true god of war, actually Wodan, doesn't look anything like a warrior. For instance, it's not like Thor. Wodan is, iconically this old man without one eye that you can see here, that is also pretty apparently. This idea also of the age is important, because it represented a greater wisdom, essentially of a corpse, because Odin actually kills himself in order to achieve the wisdom of the runes and of its message, and that came from beyond, from the world, not of the living, but the world of the dead. And here, afterlife is meant naturally also in a fully military acception. The acceptation, sorry, and maybe I don't know how you, in this meaning, sorry, I use the term acception. Many of you do not understand it, but I mean it, when I say acception, it means meaning or sense. Sorry, I realize it's not an English word now, but this is important, that Odin represented the god of afterlife, where all the dead, and I mean dead warriors, went. So the idea is, when you died, your soul passed beyond, and in the same moment of death, this is present in many cultures, obviously the soul gets a kind of knowledge that doesn't belong to the mortals, because now you're dead, and you can't be alive and being dead at the same time and understanding what it is. Naturally, Odin, or Wodan, as you want to call him, came in form of these crows and or of these also other wolves and so on, and all necrophagous animals that they were the ones that ate the corpses on the battlefield after the battle, indeed. So it was these animals were associated with that afterlife, because it's as if they literally took the person to bring it away to the world of the dead. And the idea at this point is that belonging to this comitatus, so these warrior bands that went on and went outside of society, actually even as sort of outcasts in many ways. The opposite of the comitatus is the excuse me, is the sippe. That is essentially the that moment to which the community was still sedentary, so there was a minimum also of local organization of work that didn't have to do with arms. Now the Germans, especially when they migrated from Scandinavia, that were a bit the symbol of the sippe, of this more fertile oriented world and female oriented world in the mythological figures. They get into Central Europe, and where it's a mess, they have to fight their own way through the Celts, they have to fight against each other, so they immediately form these Gefolgschaften, so these kind of bands of of followers that followed in fact the leader in the typical Indo-European fashion, to find military glory. And this is something you find actually in many other many other cultures. I mean, even the Italics had this system for which every year, basically the youngest men, given that the local resources were not able to feed them anymore, just went as bands of soldiers to conquer other lands and to seek the fortune, like that. Romulus, the founder of Rome, was, according to the legend, nothing but this. So a world that was still not even fully sedentarized, that probably in this sense, from the legends that we have, we have to understand this world as the more or less reminiscence, the vague memory of vague recollection of that ancient Indo-European world of nomadism. These populations had come from, and therefore stressing the idea that it was right. It was even the right of conquest to it was something that in fact could be backed by the celestial deity, to abandon your own village, your own house, your own family, to go to fight and to seize new lands. And if the deity, if the heavens wanted you to win, if you were proud enough, intelligent enough, skilled enough, virtuous enough in a world, you could, in fact, as a conqueror, seize that, because it was not your greed to take that. It had been the will of the heavens, of having you made win. As repeating it once again, the military glory does not belong to man. It belongs to the gods. So if you receive it, it's because you've been rewarded by the deity with your behavior. So Ódhr, by the way, in Norse mythology is also actually is a deity that is conceived as Freya's husband. In here, Ódhr, we have seen, it means kind of fury and poetry, but it can also mean mind, soul, spirit, song, inspiration. So it all belongs to this in turn, it also derives from the same Woth, because actually, if you Vod and Vod is the same Proto-Germanic root from which Ódhr comes from. It's related as the to Woths, as we were remaining before. That means raging, possessed. And Wut in Old High German means to rage, to be insane. Yeah, in Anglo-Saxon also there is Vod, there is fury, rabies, and Vod also means song, cry, voice, poetry, eloquence in the same Anglo-Saxon. So you see how everything comes from the same stock. And this deity was considered actually as an hypostasis of Odin himself. This is the suggestion that we, given the similarity also that definitely Ódhr and Odin share. So it's as if, and this is typical also of the, because another thing I like to stress is how we need to sometimes to stress polytheism as a well-defined pantheon of deities. As if in polytheism all deities were well defined, and we think that the Germans or the Celts had a pantheon like the Hellenic canon that had been developed in this highly advanced society there in the Mediterranean. This is not absolutely like that. These religions were formed. There is actually not a moment in which you can distinguish animism from polytheism. It's obviously that polytheism, by approximation, defines, first of all, it's a monotheistic invention, because before monotheism, the world didn't even conceive to itself as polytheistic, because it was normal that there were multiple gods. And even the same polytheists initially accepted monotheism as just one of the various gods, one of the various, the monotheistic god is one of the various gods that existed before. But these, in polytheism, there are no extremely well-defined characters. There are always major figures that also correspond to these broad and vague definitions, as we've seen. The same etymology of Ódhr is extremely large, and it's as if the deity corresponded to those same meanings. So even in here we need to humanize in our mind these figures, but actually they weren't quite humanized as such. I don't know, 7th century Scandinavian would have never thought of Odin as actually this extremely defined anthropomorphic figure. It was something, maybe that was just an embodiment. Odin definitely is considered also as this old wandering man that can knock at your door sometimes, and that's also entails part of the concept of how these populations lived hospitality and so on. But it was just a manifestation of a broader thing, of a larger thing. So also in here there were smaller deities, smaller figures that kind of revolved also along these bigger ones that were connected to them and not being excessively defined. This is, I think, very, very important as well. By the way, consider that the Romans, when I think, if I'm not wrong, it was Caesar himself that when discussing Woden, when he talked about the Germans, he said something like he equated them to Mercurius. And now the Romans, while writing, and also the Greeks, while writing, and any other people are allegedly, while writing about the origin of other populations, they tried to kind of enforce certain parallelisms between these figures, these deities. And it's something, even when the Romans conquered Gaul, for instance, you can see in iconography that the Romans and the Gauls kind of blended their deities together, so that certain local Celtic gods that were growing characterized in a certain way, also because Celtic society was kind of getting more complex, so they were usually, that's when polytheism begins to take to create a more defined shape of these deities, as with multiple characteristics and well-defined characters and so on. The Romans basically transformed them into that deity, so that you maybe find a figure that looks like a Mars or a Mercurius or whatever, but that has maybe that little symbol that belonged already to the Celtic deity there, because they mixed them. Because obviously also the function of these gods could be similar, so that's how they were. And it's very interesting that Caesar, if I'm not wrong, yeah, I think so, that he really said that Woden would be a sort of Germanic Mercurius. And actually in here, I think that Caesar, as usual, is extremely intelligent, because he spotted perfectly this fact that this Dionysiac role also of Mercurius sometimes as a psychopompus, as someone who brought the soul that accompanied the souls of the dead from afterlife, to life to afterlife. There were many cults associated also into which Mercury participated into this, and Woden at this time was understood to be something very similar, because indeed it was something a bit more. Also, Mercurius has so many symbolisms, we should explain them, but there was this parallelism at least between the role of accompanier of the dead into the afterlife that Woden definitely embodied. So that's what Caesar, and these were conceptions that actually were not purely, also in here, Woden was not a purely Germanic thing. This conception, this Dionysiac darker side of also conceiving this contrast between life and afterlife, is something that seemingly penetrated into Germany some time in prehistory, say in not even excessive prehistory. Obviously Germany was prehistory because they didn't write, but from Thrace, from certain Dionysiac cults that came from there, from during, I don't know, the Bronze Age, whenever it was, and developed these conceptions. Because also in here you don't have to imagine a world that was not just because not just the fact that these Indo-Europeans had nothing in common, because obviously we've seen that we're coming also from the same stock, but this doesn't also mean that they were isolated once they departed from that common stock. So they kept receiving influences also from other populations, other civilizations that were chiefly, naturally, you can imagine how influent places like Mesopotamia or Egypt were also for the Indo-Europeans. Also because the Indo-Europeans were literally all over, even the Middle East and Near East. So they knew what was there. It was a much more interconnected world than we can ever imagine. So this other also stupid kind of communitaristic perceptions according to which societies never change, they're always the same, they're utter rubbish, and that's not how we study, especially these topics that these subjects that show us the exact opposite, as these were constantly fluid systems. And so when we're talking about Odin, we're talking about essentially a sacred fury, a divine fury. So the one that you're taken by when you're possessed by, you're dominated by when you're possessed by a god. There would be so many. Also, Tacitus here says about the Germans, Deorum maxime Mercurium colunt. So they basically worship maxime, so the most, Mercury. This is obviously from the Origine ac Situ Germanorum. And yeah, Caesar said it too, because Tacitus in this sense was influenced by Caesar, that had said basically the same thing, that even in Gaul, the not just about the Germans, the how you call them, the Negromancers, essentially, of Thessaly. Wait, what I'm talking about now? Whatever, now I'm saying other things, but even there are many connections now by the necromancers of Thessaly and the daughters of Odin, the Valkyries. The Valkyries here is extremely, also the Valkyries here are very important in the Germanic mythology, always for this idea of picking up the actual corpses of the dead, as they basically decided as a sort of because eventually the Valkyries even corresponded to certain real women. I mean, there were many what we would call a bit insultingly like witches that were conceived to have also these relations, this trance that allowed them to see, to say, and women, telling the truth, into this broader Indo-European world had a very big role, as their sensitivity was conceived as capable of sensing more excuse me, more wisdom from the nature, from the surrounding nature. This is not just in the Indo-European world, but women had this enormous role, and the Valkyries were, even if you take the etymology, you can understand it from German beautifully, because Valkyria literally would be from Wahlen, that means to choose, essentially, and Küren, that would be the elected. So it was really those who picked up literally these warriors, and that eventually had necessarily to die into battle. But now this is we're going a bit astray. What I wanted to add now, what is that I wanted to add? Something important. They were associated to the Bacchantes, essentially, in part. So a kind of possession. This is what the Wood brought to a kind of possession of Furor. And in fact, when the educated Germans of the High Middle Ages, like Adam of Bremen, for whom Latin was essentially still as an imposed language, in fact, and it was extraneous from the local tradition, but albeit being still already accepted now, without so much problems, without that they could feel like it was without reluctance. They translated now in medieval Latin Woth not anymore like Vertus, but with Furor. So the Furor Teutonicus that we use, it was not actually used by the Romans. As we have seen, Woth equated to Vertus for the Latins. So this was this very strong connection between the two. Now, why did eventually these medieval Germans change it when describing, the traditions of the pagans of the north, etc.? Because the Virtus now had been transformed as a word by the Christians. So as Christians, like Adam of Bremen, naturally, who was writing Wodan id est Furor, in fact, the semantics of Virtus had really changed. They had become this model of goodness. So they couldn't use it as Christian writers in their mind as something that could describe the Furor. Partially there were ideological reasons, because indeed they couldn't say that, I don't know, a berserker had a Virtus like, I don't know, the Christian virtue. It was impossible even from a strictly linguistical point of view to even to be understood, because at that point everybody who read in Latin knew that Virtus meant that Christian thing, okay, that Christian, that had this Christian meaning. The word they arrived to choose now was Furor. So the Furor, let's looking at the etymology proper. It's maybe, I don't know if we have time to, but let's see. So it naturally means fury. So let's not go too much in depth to it. Yeah, this is maybe the idea of furor better, as it can be understood as a general, at least as we understand them today, as a general outburst of enthusiasm, if you want, an excitement, a controversy as well. Also a prevalent fad or mania or craze, fury, rage, madness. This is what furor now practically means. But also in here it was also we should look at all the other various Latin synonyms that we can find, but it would take us definitely too much. The important here is what these guys were doing now in the Middle Ages, as the furor was essentially an overwhelming force, something that enthralling, even exhilarating by certain standards, something that transfigured you, because that is also the point, that when you're possessed by the deity, you change. You're not yourself, you're that deity in that moment. And this happened also with the skins of the animals. These I don't know, certain warriors wore all over, actually all over the Indo-European world. Even the Romans wore skins when they even if they had naturally been civilized a little bit, so obviously they're wearing skin was something symbolical, but we often exchange that as just as an exterior thing, but it was still believed in that fashion. So even the Roman signiferi that carried these symbols and so on, they were really thought in there to bring the naturally a sacred symbol, as by the way the insignia were sacred, and that they needed to stress this mystical bond by wearing skins of animals that were considered sacred. The same totemic animals, I mean the Romans, before adopting the eagle as a standard, they also had horses, wolves, boars, that are also other totemic animals you find in other populations. Just recently I made a video about that actually criticizes also the strictly totemic meaning of the of such. The video is Celtic totemic animals that deals exactly with this. But just to tell you how widespread this really was, but the concept is that you transfigured, because at that point you were not just wearing. This is how our stupid modernistic mind reasons. This guy is wearing a wolf skin, so he thinks he's wearing wolf skin. No, he's not thinking he's wearing wolf skin. He thinks he is the wolf, or better, that the wolf is he. and he cannot escape. We'll get a bit more in detail to this concept of possession, because it's something extremely fascinating. Now, today we don't have minimally the time to do anything like that, but going on with also these other meanings of the world, there's a mysticism in the Furor Adam of Bremen is talking about. So in which the warrior becomes something in fact different from the one he is. So he abandons the behavior and even the human behavior and even his human appearance. In fact, by wearing this other wolf skins, but also by actually transfiguring, like, because it's as if he had another soul. So from the exterior you can see that it's someone else or something else. And so he's God and wild beast, ferocious animal at the same time. So among the Celts, for instance, there is especially in the Irish area, in the Irish Gaelic world, this concept of that you find in the Cuchulainn, that is very similar to the concept of Furor, that is expressed in terms like Dásacht, if I pronounce it correctly. You know that the Cuchulainn is basically the principal and hero of the most ancient Irish cycle, or also Ulster cycle, and the there is also in here this extremely strong warlike ethos that is also filled with, soaked with totemism, the druidism, also these smiths, these ironsmiths that were conceived as having this extremely they were also a bit connected with the underworld, because the iron was literally taken from the underworld, so it was connected here for producing swords that had to deliver that eventually. This extremely sanguine and chthonic symbolism that had to do with the afterlife, with war, and in fact there is Cuchulainn manages to kill eventually also a terrifying dog of the smith Culan, and he basically became the keeper of in place of the dog, of the goods of the smith. To understand that by killing the god of the blacksmith, because by killing the dog he had won. So the dog also in here is represented in this Gaelic world as a bit in the same Germanic fashion of the wolves. Also, it's very difficult to trace an actual difference between dogs and wolves at this point in this mythology. And by killing this dog, that it was symbol also in the sense of the afterlife, of the deity of the afterlife, of the underworld, he got this wisdom that was associated also to sword making, weapon making, that is this typical rite of initiation that also existed when those warriors entered into the brotherhood that went to fight and so on. So that's also extremely beautiful, and the word here that is used to express Furor is in Gaelic Dásacht, if I pronounce it correctly, and the and Dásacht, in fact, means, etymologically speaking, something very interesting that sounds more like insania. This may be a foolish, senseless, but here probably there is a bit of a semantic shade that maybe didn't interpret it fully. It's this idea of rage, of madness that was associated, however, still to the wisdom, as we have seen. So it was not something totally lost. I mean, also in here we should go deeper in another video to understand what really, even the how controversial this rage, this madness was, because it was indeed something divine, but we don't to consider it as fully positive, because it was a sort of condemnation, because the people who suffered of this, that today we can even think that were actually suffering of real psychological pathologies and so on, and they were chosen because of this, and seen as, after all, even epileptic people were conceived to be divinely touched by the deity, because it's as if they believed to be possessed, for instance. And that's what actually also the etymology of epileptic is, because it comes from Greek, which means epileptos. So it means literally to be chosen, up, over, high. It's like the Valkyrie, Valkyren, so chosen, the elected. So you see here how everything really comes back in circle. These were conceived as the same things. It was a sort of madness that, however, was also sacred, divine. We will have time to go once again into this. And another very and this term of Dásacht, if I pronounce it, or Dásacht, I don't know, just to pronounce it really correctly in Gaelic, but has been associated by a great scholar like Dumezil, that is a bit outmoded today, because he's been accused of being essentially a far right wing, and surely he had some, but his works are extraordinary. So if you're interested into, they're not history of war, but they're history of religion that tells us so much about this Indo-European world and of the. So please read him. And this that I'm about to express is from the book the Horace et les Curias. That the Irish Dásacht is connected to the Greek Thyás, that is essentially the Bacchanti, or to the Ferg, that in I think also in the Nordic, in the same, its presence also in the Irish world, but also its presence also in Northern Europe and Scandinavian countries. I think as a term, the Ferg of Ferg, I don't know. That really means, in fact, anger, bad temper, exasperation, passion, ferocity, and even heat. Because these guys got definitely heated. It was something, these guys fought on the battlefield as well. So if you get frenzied, frenetic, and so on, you can't fight. But we knew that these guys fought to exhaustion. These fanatics, these berserkers, as you want to call. But that is something that really destroys your body, because the average soldier, even to be functional afterwards, the average human being cannot stress himself too much. It's renowned that in real war, melee cannot last more than a few minutes, because people cannot stand longer fights. This is like the ABC of military history. These guys went on because they were really possessed, they were crazed, and they destroyed their body in the process. And there were even certain rituals that are expressed also in the by Ódhr himself in the Norse mythology, that entailed self-mutilation. Odin sticks. He stabs himself with a lance, and this was meant to be done by these warriors, all the warriors that belong to the Comitatus, as an initiatory proof. So extremely violent initiations. That, by the way, seemingly the ritual of dubbing in chivalry actually is reminiscent of, like the slap on the guys. And they say that is seemingly the reminiscence of such initiatory rites that existed into the Germanic Comitatus, and more generally speaking in the Comitatus of the whole Indo-European peoples back in the day. So that and also in chivalry you see that basically after the dubbing, you as a knight have a duty that you can't come back. You always have to be theoretically pure, and all, in fact, virtuous in a Christian way at that point in history. So here you realize also how the etymologists meant how that world in many ways was also much more secular than the previous one. So civilization progressed, and partly these meanings were also lost, as we've seen even with Adam of Bremen, that was already looking at from the distance at that past. But before, it was something really widespread and relatively now expressed Ferg, but the Greek Thyás that had been associated to the Dásacht is actually also very, very, very interesting from an etymological point of view in the Indo-European languages, because Thyás means in ancient Greek to be literally possessed by a god, a person who is the bacchante, in fact, that agitates. Especially, I think Thyás is referred to females only. So this bacchante that followed the Dionysus into the Bacchanalia, in fact, and that, however, were carried away. Now, we depicted the Bacchanalia as essentially as an orgy, but it wasn't really conceived entirely, at least like that, because such things happened also in other rites. There were certain very strong sexual meanings attached, but generally speaking, even when Caesar and Tacitus, or say better, Kaiser, at this point, Caesar and Tacitus, let's say better, talk in ecclesiastical pronunciation, but their real names were Kaiser and Tacitus. They talked about the association between Woden and Mercury, but also because Mercury had this kind of frenetic rites that kind of were meant to make people go beyond, to really be possessed by a god, because now they were going somewhere else. So the Ferg and the Dásacht are connected to the Thyás because that's exactly what it meant. And in Greek, here there is the Theo, that means to agitate furiously or to rage. Thiazo, that means to be taken by the Dionysiac delirium. Tiella, that infuriates, and it can also be a storm. Remember Woden and the thundering sky. Also Jupiter Tonans. That's it. The Tiella is the storm. It's the divine storm of the celestial deity that is arriving with the lightning. It's the same lightning that the Roman eagle keeps into her clothes. Do you realize how this really comes so much? It's when the tempest arrives, you hear that these people believed it was their gods that were arriving. There is a beautiful passage from Paul the Diacon when the Longobards fight against the Eruli, and the Longobards have from their side the thundering storm arriving, and that was Woden. And guess who won there? You see how beautiful this is. The Thyás tino means in ancient Greek to take this. It's a very physical also movement. It means essentially to fling. To leap, to launch yourself, essentially. So to rage also in this. You see this very physical thing. You can see even in the, I don't know, in the violent charges that this Celtic or Germanic populations did so violently, so furiously, because they launched literally themselves against the enemy. They were being possessed by the deity in that moment. That's the point. Thyás is the sacrificial offer. It's the sacrifice. Is literally it's really what in this offers arrived to the skies in form of smoke that was felt what the gods were receiving in the skies from these sacred to these sacrifices. Typhodes means frenetic. Typhon is the wind that swirls and surrounds, embraces everything in this swirl of smoke. Typhoon is the same word, it's the same etymology, giving these extremely violent, strong sensations of force that really make you understand what that possession really is. Typhosis means to be blinded by the smoke. To be also, you have to think also at the aftermath of such behaviors. These people were essentially brutalizing themselves. They were demeaning themselves physically even after these experiences. Timon means to enrage, but in the sense of make smoke, to be inflamed, to be heated. Timodes means to be on fire, to be bold. See the Audacia, the Woths, the Vertus, it all comes together. And then, in Sanskrit, for instance, you have the same thing. The root word here in Sanskrit is a little. It comes from the same language, but it's a little different. It's it's do, not the, but they come from the same thing. And also because in Greek it's not really the, it would be something like to. It's between a u and an I. And you see, do naughty in Sanskrit means to wave, to shake. Duta means agitated, agitator. Duna means shaken. And this thing of the smoke, of the dust, is something that is associated to the rites of, as the root do, it means to call, to invoke, and it also means, it comes from, because do, so this tu also, as it comes, derives from di, that means light, and hu, that means to call, to invoke. So, do you understand what this means? It means that this fury, this furor, was meant to invoke, to call the deity, to invoke the light. The light is the deity of the skies, the days of the heaven. And so to do this, this root means to lighten up the fire. Some of the most important Vedic rites revolved around the fire. This is something they passed also to the Persians. The purifying fire, to make smoke, to sacrifice. Because it's as if in this moment these people were sacrificing themselves. That's the point. By launching yourself like a wild beast against the enemy ranks meant to sacrifice yourself, to give your whole body in offer to the deity, and to make a mess, to light up a fire, to make smoke, to agitate, to shake. This is the meaning. This is the meaning of the Indo-European culture. And this goes all together with burning up yourself as a sacrifice for the gods. The Romans had famously the devotio. So the idea that they literally offered themselves, their life, to the deity in order to achieve victory. And if they didn't die, it was a mess, because they were lost. They had lost their own identity forever. Then eventually the Romans kind of civilized a little bit, and they began to substitute this very violent thing by, in the case the general didn't die, he could bury an effigy of himself in the place of his actual corpse. But that was the point, that when you were possessed by these deities, it was like into the Germanic comitatus, you were an outcast. You didn't belong to that world anymore, because you now belong to the deity. So it's the Roman devotio, or devotio in ecclesiastical pronunciation. It's the same thing. So never think of the Romans, the Germans, the Celts as something different, because they all came in their military mindset from the same thing. And I will never be able to stress this enough. Go out, tell these things, because these are things that nobody's telling us. Nobody's telling us in the schools, and that's what we come from. And it has nothing to do with a strictly ethnic thing. It's really saying, look, that our world, the words that we use, the behaviors that we have, all come from this. And this is really the matrix of our... we're talking so much about a united European Union, this idea of feeling one together. Yes, because objectively, 19th century national state is the betrayal of Indo-European culture. Because before we were all together, and we felt like this because we knew we had to stick together and to be one and to act as one and to be able to sacrifice ourselves. Today we're not able, because we're a bunch of inbred morons who believe that just because they're born on a piece of soil, you're special. You're not. You're most likely not. Most likely you're rubbish. And you should learn these things to become a better person, I believe. And forgive me for this rant, but I get really, in fact, very lightened up, very much Wothend indeed, like the Woth, because of this, because I really feel this. I think it's beautiful, it's fantastic, and historically speaking, it's so damn educational, and we can all benefit from this, because we ultimately can learn this. It's full of beautiful books, and for now maybe we stop, because this is almost 2 hours, but I hope that this video will be the first one of a long series in which I will go deeper into these things. So this is not over. This is just a tiny bit the beginning of a much broader thing. I won't be discussing this very frequently though, so it will take like ages. I think I will be dead before I will be able to say every single thing that I want to tell to you, but the better it is, as I hope that Schwerpunkt in this sense, and unless I die earlier than expected, which will probably be anyway, I will be able to deliver you these things if you're interested, of course. But I think they are interesting for what they are. Maybe I'm not such a great storyteller. I'm not such a great. I don't stay in shade. I digress every time. I'm messy. I don't find the right words. But that's what I want to get to you, so that you can also learn these things by yourself. So let's talk about these things, because they're very, very, very important. Let's never forget these things, because as long as we remember, as long as we know our history, I'm not making it a communitarian point. I'm really making it a matter of this wisdom that is not necessarily positive, it's not necessarily negative, but is what can give us the sop and the virtue, the Vertus in a Latin way, that we need to make this world better. And I'm truly convinced of this. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.